Western Cape High Court last week dismissed the interdict of 43 companies within the Sekunjalo group to stop Netbank from closing the accounts of the group's related companies. Now, Sekunjalo's interdict was in response to a notice by Netbank in November 2021 to cut ties with the media group. The Netbank group was the third one of the South African large banks to cut ties with Sekunjalo. And in late 2020, Absa became the first major bank in South Africa to sever relations with Sekunjalo, followed by FNB in March 2021. AmaBhungane journalist and investigator Dewald van Rensburg joins us to discuss the extent of Iqbal Survé's banking woes and, of course, the implications for Sekunjalo. And Dewald, thanks so much for your time. Welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you. No.
So an interesting scenario, and it certainly does hark back to what happened with the Guptas and their related companies in the years before we saw a new administration. So let's talk about Netbank and why they have decided to follow Absa and, of course, FNB in the course of action that they took.
Well, I mean, in court papers, Netbank sets out its reasoning. It makes the point, however, first of all, that it doesn't really need to give reasons contractually. It can choose to bank wherever it wants to. But it does essentially say the same thing that Absa and FNB before it had said, which is that it's a reputational risk being associated with Iqbal Survé and his company, Sekunjalo. And I think there's a misconception about what's meant by reputational risk. People seem to think it means, well, you and I on the street think less of the bank because it banks this man and his company. That's not what it means. What it means is that the bank's reputation within the global banking system is at risk. When you have someone who is publicly accused of things that sound like money laundering, that, although not proven, sound like corruption, that risks the bank's standing and its relationships with other institutions in the financial sector. It's not so much a question of the fact that Dewald thinks that they're a crappy bank because they bank Iqbal Survé.
So the bank also goes on to say, Netbank, this is that its reputation was in jeopardy in dealing with any company related to the Sekunjalo group. So let's explain that as well, Dewald, and the reasons causing those concerns for Netbank.
Okay, so I mean, there's 2 points in that. Whatever is true of the Sekunjalo group is true of all its subsidiaries, essentially. You can't say, well, I'm not going to bank you, but this company you own can have an account and you can just keep the money there. I mean, that's illogical because the money would simply move there. In terms of the entire group being suspect, I think that's also a point to make, because in its court papers, Netbank provides a lot of supporting documents, which is largely emails and letters between itself and Sekunjalo, kind of arguing and negotiating about the closures of the accounts. Now, among those, there are all these queries that Netbank had of strange transactions that it once explained, and those traverse the entire group. Those are between the companies in the group. So it's not as though it's just Iqbal Survé or just Sekunjalo that they had a problem with. It was about the entire network of interactions between all these companies.
So if we take a look at this, Dewald, sometime last year, we had BT, which is a UK firm known as British Telecom. If you remember, they also terminated relations with Sekunjalo, and they found a new South African BE partner. They distanced themselves from the association, citing a situation of misrepresentation of facts to Parliament. Now, Iqbal Survé, who is at the center of all of this. Now, allegations against Iqbal Survé have been in the news for quite a long time. You'll remember the PIC inquiry where AO Technology Solutions featured quite prominently. Now, is there something that we are missing here? Because what are the developments that brought these sudden decisions, given that there are other developments that took place before this?
Well, you can argue that people have taken too much time or given too much slack, I suppose. But to be fair, you can't just drop someone if you have a contract for no reason. I mean, this thing you cite is contractual breaks. Misrepresentation, I suppose, is something that might have been in the contract they can use to get rid of the association. But they certainly have not been happy for some time. That's British Telecoms. It's Sasol, which also cut their ties for a major contract some time ago. It's almost from the very beginning, when IO listed on the JSE in December 2017. The first thing it did was make BT angry because it was going to use so much of the money it got from the PIC at that point to simply have one part of Sekunjalo buy a stake in BT from another part of Sekunjalo. That kind of thing was almost the point of IO to begin with, and that doesn't look good, and it never did. The bad news about IO started when I wrote about them almost 3 months into their listing, and it was clear that things were not, okay.
So if we look at what's happening here, there's obviously quite a lot at stake, Dewald, with all the business acquisitions, the media ownership under Sekunjalo. What kind of complications and implications could there be for Sekunjalo faced with the sort of situation at the moment? And if this persists to a point that the group cannot do or operate as a business and can't sustain its businesses?
Well, it's the worst option is that it ends up like the Gupta group of companies to which the same thing happened. The banks unbanked them, and eventually they had to close and leave the country or sell off the assets because you can't run a business without banking accounts. There are two alternative scenarios. One, which is unlikely to really work out in any kind of long term, is to use third-party paying agents, where you have an intermediary company into which you pay money. That company then deals with transactions on your behalf, and it tries to be as transparent as possible, find favor with the banks and so on. This is unlikely to work because it's so transparently just a proxy mechanism, and I don't think it will solve any of the problems necessarily that the banks have had. Another potential option is to find bits and pieces within the group that are not sanctioned that are not punished by the bank or debanked by all the banks. Ones that are perhaps minority owned and not controlled by the Sekunjalo group. I think that potentially might be the way they go about it.
What about the role of the banks themselves, Dewald? Because if you look at how all of this has played out, have they dropped the ball at some point, breached some laws that they should have complied with in almost, allowing this sort of situation to develop?
Well, what is clear from the Nedbank court papers is that they have for some time actually been looking at the Sekunjalo group and identifying what in banking is simply called suspicious transactions. Now, as a regulated entity, a bank is obliged when it sees suspicious transactions to report those to the Prudential Authority, which is the Reserve Bank. And although it doesn't say so explicitly, I presume they've actually done so a couple of times, and I presume the other banks have also. The kind of transactions that they flagged involve millions of rands moving for no apparent reason. So that's the kind of thing that you raise a flag about. So within the bank, I'm sure there have been qualms, but again, our banks aren't exactly saints. It's not that they see something suspicious and they kick you to the curb immediately, not if you have a couple of billion rand in the system and your business is worth something. I mean, the banks are not, heroes. They're just looking after themselves.
And you're absolutely right. They are not saints, as we saw Netbank itself being flagged in the state capture report for their involvement with regiments, as an example. And this raises the question for some about, the banks and then, of course, consistency, if you will, in how they deal with various businesses and entities when it comes to when and who they decide not to do business with.
Well, yeah, so this is cited by the Sekunjalo Group and Iqbal Survé in their court papers. It's been a bugbear for some time. He has advanced this attack in the newspapers he controls, the Star, the Cape Times, the August, which is simply to say, wow, this is a racist decision. The inconsistency that they argue is, well, you've kept banking Steinhoff, you've kept banking Tom Hewlett, you've kept banking EOH. These are all large listed companies that have had major frauds from the executives, manipulation of the accounts, massive destruction of value, lots of actual prejudice to people who own shares, which is you, me, and everyone of a pension fund. So yes, the argument then is these people have committed fraud and their banking accounts are safe. The reply from Netbank, and which I think is probably the logical response, is that, well, all of these groups have admitted to fraud, been found more or less guilty in various forums, and all their bosses have been fired and they've paid fines. So there's been a remedial action, whereas at Sekunjalo there's been nothing of the sort. So that is the essential difference. That's the argument. It's like, wow, yes, we're still banking Steinhoff, for instance, but we got rid of Marcus Jooste. He's been fined 100 million rand. The company has had forensic investigations, been fined, and so on and so forth. So, yeah, and when this argument goes to court, and it will, this is kind of a last-ditch effort, that's the argument the banks are going to make.
An interesting one, and one looks forward to hearing those arguments ventilated before the courts. There have been some questions as well, Dewald, about whether the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the JSE, is doing anything to protect investors, seeing what the action by the banks are right now. Are they protecting investors against these companies if these allegations are in fact, going to be sustained, that the banks will wholesale close them down?
I feel people expect far too much of the JSE. I mean, it is a private company. It seeks the business of people to list on it. It's not a great regulator. It's not really a regulator at all. It's been mostly reactive. When things get too bad, the publicity gets too bad, it tends to react and punish companies and take some kind of action. I mean, in the background, it does have investigations. It has had investigations into IO directors specifically, for instance, and it has censored them. Recently, two former directors were punished. They were banned from holding directorships for 5 years on a listed company. Obviously, JSE can't affect change anywhere else. But yeah, insofar as you expect the JSE to do something, I was actually a bit surprised when we initially learned about the banks starting to cancel the accounts of the Sekunjalo Group, which is when Absa initially did it in 2020, FNB followed last year. Initially, Sekunjalo didn't even tell the JSE. It didn't even put out a release to investors, despite the obvious seriousness of the situation. I found that quite astonishing, and it did subsequently. I mean, I queried them about it after the Absa incident, and with FNB, they did then inform the market, but it still seems that they've been very reticent to be transparent about what's been happening with the banks. It's been revealed in these court papers that practically all the banks in the country have been approached and have rejected their business by now. Their last remaining accounts, I think, are with Standard Bank, and those probably won't last long. Whether the JSE is monitoring it or has been kept appraised of the situation, I don't know. It certainly hasn't given any indication that it has.
So just a final question, Dewald. So at the center of all of this is, of course, Iqbal Survé. Has there been any successful cases that have been brought before the courts regarding all the allegations leveled against Iqbal Survé? You had the PIC inquiry and many other allegations leveled against him, but has there been any findings in a court of law?
Well, what you have is a whole bunch of court cases sitting in the courts and having ground to a halt due to kind of technicalities and deadlocks. So the PIC is trying to basically sue for 4.3 billion rand, is trying to liquidate the independent media company. I think a more serious problem for Iqbal Survé is the investigation ongoing by the Financial Sector Conduct Authority, which is investigating market manipulation against a number of his companies related to the share price of IO and other companies over certain periods, which was suspiciously maintained at high levels. That could be a very serious one. But he hasn't been found guilty, certainly not of anything criminal. In the PIC Commission report, obviously a lot of bad things were said about him, which he takes issue with, he denies strenuously. But I mean, that is not a court of law. Those are not, findings by a judge leading to a fine and or imprisonment or punishment. Those are meant to be the basis of an investigation by the Hawks, if it should come to that, or of court cases, which is the case now. Now, if we could just wait for these court cases to actually come to fruition, I mean, all the stuff will be tested, there will be discovery, evidence will be exchanged. I think we will finally have a lot more closure. But other than that, I mean, the evidence we have provided, myself and others, I think is pretty indicative and hard to ignore.
Well, we'll leave it there for today, but thank you so much, AmaBhungane journalist and investigator Dewald van Rensburg, discussing, of course, the extent and the implications of Iqbal Survé's tight predicament as South Africa's largest banks close his accounts. And the implications of this, of course, is something that we will know about. It will spill over, and we'll keep an eye on these developments.